The lobby of the Hawthorne Club had gone quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Not the natural hush of a room full of people who had simply run out of things to say. The kind of quiet that meant everyone in it was listening to the same thing. And that thing was Catherine Vaughn's voice, still carrying, still pitched exactly loud enough to be heard by the people who mattered. She had positioned herself at the entrance, one hand resting on the podium, the other gesturing toward the door with the kind of polished finality that made clear the conversation was not a conversation. It was a dismissal. David stood where he had stopped, Elle still in his arms, Pebbles the penguin pressed between them. He had not moved toward the door. He had not moved at all. He was looking at Catherine with an expression that was difficult to read, not angry, not confused, just attentive in a way that seemed to take in more than what was directly in front of him. Like a man reading a room for exits and entrances, not because he was afraid, but because he had been trained to know where they were before he needed them. "I understand the club has standards," David said. His voice was low, unhurried. "I'm asking who sets them, and whether those standards are written down somewhere, or whether they change depending on who walks through the door." Catherine's smile tightened at the edges. It was a small adjustment, the kind most people would miss. David did not miss it. "Our membership criteria are confidential, as I'm sure you understand," she said. "But I can assure you they are applied consistently." "Consistently," David repeated. He let the word sit for a moment. Then he looked past her, toward the main lounge, where a man in a cream linen jacket was being welcomed with a warm handshake and a glass of champagne. The man had walked in 30 seconds after David had been stopped. He had not been asked for a membership card. He had not been asked anything. Catherine followed David's gaze. Something flickered across her face, there and gone, but David had already seen it. "That gentleman is a member," she said. "He's been with us for 7 years." "I didn't ask how long had been here," David said. "I just noticed you didn't stop him." Elle shifted against his shoulder. Her voice came out soft, the way it did when she was working through something she didn't fully understand. "Daddy, why did that man get to go in, but we have to stay out here?" The question landed in the space between them with the clean, unanswerable weight of a child who had not yet learned to soften the truth for the comfort of adults. Catherine's smile had gone brittle. She looked at Elle, then at David, and something in her posture shifted. Not toward warmth, toward something harder. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation outside," she said. And she stepped forward, one hand reaching for the door handle, as if to open it for them. As if to make clear that this was no longer an invitation. It was an escort. David did not move toward the door. He shifted Elle's weight to his other arm, adjusted Pebbles so the penguin's beak wasn't pressed into his daughter's cheek, and stood exactly where he was. The stillness was not defiance. It was the stillness of a man who had spent 7 years in the army learning that the first person to move in a confrontation was usually the one who had already lost. Catherine's hand remained on the door handle. She was waiting for him to comply. And the silence between them stretched long enough that a man at the bar turned to look. Then a woman near the fireplace. Then the concierge, a young man in his late 20s with a name tag that read Adrian, who had been watching the entire exchange from behind the reception desk with the particular tension of someone who knew something was wrong, but had no authority to name it. "Sir," Catherine said, her voice dropping to something quieter, something that was meant to sound reasonable, but landed somewhere closer to a threat. "I'm going to ask you one more time to leave the premises. If you do not, I will be forced to call security. And I would prefer not to do that with your daughter present." Elle heard the word daughter and looked up at her father. She did not say anything. She simply waited because she trusted him and because at 6 years old she had already learned that her father's silence usually meant he was thinking about something important. David looked at Catherine. He looked at the lobby behind her, at the dark wood paneling and the brass fixtures and the grandfather clock that had been shipped from Edinburgh at a cost of nearly $40,000. He knew the exact number because he had approved the invoice. He knew the cost of the chandelier above the staircase. He knew the square footage of the main lounge and the annual water bill for the garden terrace. He knew these things not because he was a meticulous businessman, though he was, but because he had read every page of the acquisition documents before he signed them. Every line item, every appendix, every footnote. The Hawthorne Club was not just a club he belonged to. It was an asset he owned 67% of, held through a holding company that bore his late wife's maiden name precisely, so that his name would never appear on any public document. He had done it deliberately. He had wanted to be able to walk into any property in the portfolio and see what actually happened there when no one knew who he was. And tonight, he was seeing exactly what he needed to see. "You're right about one thing," David said. His voice was calm, the way still water is calm, not because nothing is moving beneath it, but because whatever is moving has not yet decided to surface. "I don't want my daughter to see this get ugly." He looked down at Elle. "Baby, I need you to trust me for a few more minutes. Can you do that?" Elle nodded without hesitation. She had her mother's eyes, large and steady, and she used them now to look at her father with the complete, unguarded faith that only a child can offer a parent she has never had reason to doubt. David reached into his pocket and took out his phone. He did not unlock it immediately. He held it in his hand for a moment, looking at Catherine with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was not far from one. "You've been here how long?" he asked. 7 years, Catherine said. The word came out sharp, defensive. 7 years, David repeated. He nodded slowly, as if filing the information away. That's a long time to run a place without ever wondering who actually owns it. Catherine's face did not change, but something behind her eyes did. A flicker, a crack. The smallest shift in the foundation of certainty she had been standing on all evening. David unlocked his phone and scrolled to a contact he had not called in nearly 8 months. He pressed dial and raised the phone to his ear. The call rang twice, 3 times. Then a voice answered, low and immediate. "David, it's late. What's going on?" David looked at Catherine, at the door she was still holding open, at the concierge who had gone completely still behind the reception desk. "I'm at the Hawthorne," he said. "I need you to come down here, and I need you to bring the partnership agreement." The phone call lasted 23 seconds. David said 6 sentences total, listened for 8, and ended the call with the same unhurried precision with which he did most things. He slid the phone back into his pocket and looked at Catherine, whose hand had finally dropped from the door handle. She was watching him now with a different kind of attention, the kind a person gives when they are no longer certain they are in control of the situation but are not yet willing to admit it. "Who was that?" she asked. Her voice had lost some of its polish. The edges were showing. David did not answer. He looked past her, toward the concierge desk, where Adrian was standing with his hands flat on the counter, his eyes moving between Catherine and David with the rapid, calculating attention of someone trying to decide whether he should intervene or disappear. "Adrian," David said. The young man's head came up sharply. "Yes, sir. How long have you worked here?" 18 months, sir. David nodded. And in that time, have you ever seen someone denied entry the way I was denied entry tonight? Adrian's mouth opened. He looked at Catherine, then back at David, and something in his face shifted. Not defiance, not fear. Something closer to recognition. The look of a man who has been waiting for permission to tell the truth and has just realized it might have arrived. Yes, sir, he said quietly. I have. Catherine turned to face him. Her voice was ice. Adrian, I would be very careful about what you say next. Adrian did not look at her. He kept his eyes on David, and his voice, when it came, was steady in a way that suggested he had made his decision before he opened his mouth. 3 times that I've seen personally, maybe more that I didn't witness. Always the same pattern. Someone walks in who doesn't fit the profile, and Ms. Vaughn handles it personally. No documentation. No written record. Just a quiet escort to the door. David absorbed this without changing expression. He looked at Catherine, whose face had gone tight and bloodless at the edges. A pattern, David said. That's interesting. Elle shifted against his shoulder. She had been quiet through most of the exchange, her small hand resting on the worn fabric of Pebbles the penguin, her eyes moving between the adults with the serious, unblinking attention of a child who understood more than she let on. Daddy, she whispered, is she going to be in trouble? David looked down at his daughter. The hardness in his face softened, just slightly, the way it always did when he looked at her. That depends on what happens next, baby. Elle considered this. Then she looked at Catherine with the frank, unguarded curiosity of someone who had not yet learned to filter her observations through politeness. I don't think she likes us very much, Elle said. The statement was not accusatory. It was observational, the way a child might note that the sky was gray or that the refrigerator made a funny noise. But it landed in the room with the weight of something undeniable. Catherine opened her mouth to respond. But before she could form words, the front door of the club swung open. A man stepped through, silver-haired, wearing a dark overcoat that he had not fully buttoned, carrying a leather briefcase in one hand. He was in his early 60s, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from something durable and left to weather naturally. He stopped just inside the entrance, took in the scene in a single sweep, and walked directly toward David. He did not look at Catherine. He did not look at Adrian. He walked past the grandfather clock and the brass fixtures and the $40,000 chandelier, and stopped in front of David with the particular gravity of a man who understood exactly what he was walking into. David, he said, I came as fast as I could. The man set his briefcase on the reception desk and opened it with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had done this exact thing many times before, though never quite under these circumstances. His name was Harold Chun, and he had been David's lawyer for 11 years, since before the first property, since before the holding company, since before any of this existed as anything more than a conversation between 2 men in a diner in Queens at 2 in the morning. Harold pulled out a thick manila folder and set it on the counter. He did not open it. Not yet. He turned to face Catherine, who had not moved from her position near the entrance. And his expression was the carefully neutral expression of a man who had spent decades in courtrooms learning how to say nothing while communicating everything. Ms. Vaughn, Harold said. I'm Harold Chun. I represent the majority shareholder of the Hawthorne Group, which owns this club in its entirety. Catherine's face had gone through several changes in the last 60 seconds, none of them in her favor. The polished composure had cracked. What remained was something thinner, more brittle, the expression of a woman who had spent 7 years building a kingdom and was just now realizing she had never checked who held the deed. "I don't understand," she said. "The Hawthorne Group is managed by a board. I report to the board." Harold nodded slowly. "You report to an operating committee that reports to the board. The board reports to the shareholders. And the majority shareholder," as he paused, turned the folder toward her and tapped a finger on the signature page. Catherine leaned forward. She read the name. She read it again. Her hand came up to grip the edge of the counter. And for a long moment, she did not speak. David shifted L to his other arm and took a step closer. His voice was quiet, not triumphant, not cruel, just quiet. 7 years, Ms. Vaughn. 7 years running a place you never bothered to learn who actually owned. Catherine's eyes came up to meet his. There was something in them now that had not been there before. Not shame, not yet, but the beginning of an understanding that was still forming, still too large for her to fully hold. "You should have told someone," she said. Her voice had gone thin. "You should have identified yourself." "Any reasonable person would have what?" David interrupted. His voice was still calm. But there was something underneath it now, a weight that had been sitting in his chest all evening and was finally beginning to surface. "Would have dressed differently? Would have called ahead? Would have made sure I looked like I belonged before I walked through the door of my own building?" He let the question hang in the air. The room had gone completely silent. The man at the bar had set down his drink. The woman near the fireplace had turned in her chair. Even the jazz from the speakers seemed to have faded into something distant and irrelevant. "That's not how this works," David said. "That's not how any of this works. The standard isn't supposed to change depending on who walks through the door. The standard is supposed to be the standard. Every time. For everyone." Elle tugged gently on his collar. Her voice was soft, meant only for him. "Daddy, is that man going to help us?" David looked down at her, then at Harold, then back at Catherine, who was still gripping the edge of the counter as if letting go would mean falling. "Yeah, baby," he said. "He already has." Harold closed the folder and returned it to his briefcase with the same measured precision with which he had opened it. He looked at Catherine, then at David, and something in his posture shifted, a slight straightening that signaled he was moving from observation to action. "Ms. Vaughn," Harold said, "I need to ask you a direct question, and I need you to answer it honestly. Have you, at any point in your tenure at this club, denied entry to an individual based on your personal assessment of whether they fit the membership profile, without documented policy justification?" Catherine's jaw tightened. She looked at the folder, then at David, then back at Harold. Her voice, when it came, had lost its earlier sharpness. It was quieter now, the voice of someone who understood that the ground beneath her had shifted and was still shifting. "I have exercised professional judgment in the interest of maintaining the club's standards," she said. "That is within my authority as general manager." Harold nodded slowly. "That's not what I asked." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything Catherine was not saying, everything she had done over 7 years that she had never written down, never documented, never left a paper trail for. Because she had never imagined anyone would ask. Adrian, still standing behind the reception desk, cleared his throat. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the silence. "Ms. Vaughn, I have the shift logs from the last 18 months. If you want me to retrieve them." Catherine's head snapped toward him. "That won't be necessary." "Actually," David said, "I think it will." He looked at Adrian, and his voice softened, just slightly. "Go ahead. Bring the logs." Adrian moved before Catherine could respond, disappearing through a door behind the reception desk. Catherine stood alone in the center of the lobby, the polished woman who had run this room for 7 years, now reduced to watching a concierge follow orders from a man in a worn jacket she had tried to throw out 20 minutes ago. Elle had fallen quiet again, her head resting against David's shoulder, pebbles tucked under her chin. She was watching Catherine with the same frank, unblinking attention she had maintained all evening, and there was something in her expression that was not quite judgment. It was closer to curiosity, the way a child watches an adult who is doing something they do not fully understand. "Daddy," Elle whispered, "is she scared?" David considered the question. He looked at Catherine, at the tight set of her shoulders, at the way her hand was still gripping the edge of the counter, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "I think she's starting to understand something she didn't understand before," David said. "And that can feel a lot like being scared." Elle nodded slowly, processing this. Then she looked at Catherine directly and said, in a voice that was clear and unhurried, "It's okay to be wrong. My teacher says that's how we learn." Catherine's face did something complicated. It moved through several expressions in quick succession, none of them settling long enough to be named. She opened her mouth to respond, but Adrian returned before she could speak, carrying a slim binder in his hands. He crossed to David and held it out. "The shift logs, sir, including tonight." David took the binder. He did not open it. He held it in his hands and looked at Catherine, and his voice, when he spoke, carried something that had not been there before. Not anger, something closer to disappointment. "7 years," he said, "and you never once asked yourself who you were really working for." David held the binder in his hands for a long moment, feeling its weight, the thin cardboard cover, the metal rings that held the pages inside. He did not open it. Not yet. He looked at Catherine, whose face had settled into something that was trying very hard to look composed and failing at the edges. "I'm not going to read this tonight," David said. "Not here. Not in front of everyone." Catherine's eyes flickered. Something moved beneath the surface of her expression, relief or suspicion or both. "I'm going to take it home. I'm going to read every page. And then I'm going to decide what happens next." He paused, letting the words settle. "But I want you to understand something, Ms. Vaughn. This isn't about tonight. Tonight was just the night I happened to walk through the door. This is about every other night. Every other person you turned away because they didn't look like they belonged. Every judgment you made without a policy to back it up. Every time you decided that your personal standard was the only standard that mattered." Catherine's voice was barely audible. "I was trying to protect the club." "No," David said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You were trying to protect your idea of the club. Those are two different things, and one of them doesn't belong to you." Elle shifted against his shoulder. Her voice came out soft, barely more than a breath. "Daddy, can we go home now? I'm hungry." The simplicity of the request cut through the tension in the room like a blade through fabric. Harold let out a small breath that might have been a laugh. Adrian's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. Even Catherine's posture seemed to sag, as if the reminder that there was a world outside this lobby, a world of hungry children and tired fathers and ordinary life, had finally punctured something she had been holding together. David looked down at his daughter. Her eyes were heavy, her grip on pebbles loose. She had been awake far past her normal bedtime, had watched her father be humiliated in a place she did not understand. And all she wanted was dinner and her own bed. Yeah, Baby, he said, we're going home. He looked at Harold. They'll call you tomorrow. We'll figure out the next steps. Harold nodded. They'll have a draft of recommendations ready by noon. David turned to Adrian, who was still standing near the reception desk, his hands at his sides, his expression carrying the particular tension of someone who had just done something brave and was only now beginning to feel the weight of it. You did good tonight, David said. I won't forget it. Adrian nodded once, a small, tight movement. Thank you, sir. David looked at Catherine one last time. She was standing exactly where she had been when Harold walked in, still gripping the edge of the counter, her face a mask of controlled stillness that was doing a poor job of hiding the chaos beneath it. They'll be in touch, Miss Vaughn, David said. And then he turned, Elle in his arms, pebbles pressed between them, and walked out of the Hawthorne Club. The night air hit David's face as he stepped through the door, cool and clean and ordinary. The street was quiet, lined with brownstones and the occasional taxi drifting past. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, Elle still in his arms, and let himself breathe. He had not realized how tight his chest had been until the pressure released. Elle lifted her head from his shoulder and looked around. The streetlights cast long amber pools across the pavement, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked twice and fell silent. Daddy, she said, where's the car? A few blocks that way, David said, nodding toward the east. Can you walk, or do you want me to carry you? Elle considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important decisions. Carry me, she said, but you can put Pebbles in my backpack. He's heavy. David smiled, the first real smile that had touched his face all evening. He adjusted Elle's weight, slid the small penguin into the front pocket of her backpack, and started walking. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes late on a weeknight when most people are already home. They passed a deli with a warm yellow glow spilling onto the sidewalk, a woman walking a small dog, a man locking up a bicycle. Ordinary things. The kind of things that reminded David why he had built what he built. Not for the rooms, or the chandeliers, or the brass fixtures. For the ordinary moments. For the chance to walk down a quiet street with his daughter and not have to explain why someone had tried to make them feel small. Daddy, Elle said, her voice soft and sleepy. Why did that lady not want us to come in? David walked a few more steps before answering. He wanted to get it right. She made a mistake, he said. She saw us and decided she knew who we were before she actually knew anything about us. And she was wrong. I'll process this. Is she going to get in trouble? That depends on what she does next, David said. If she learns from it, maybe not. If she doesn't, then yes. Probably. Elle nodded against his shoulder. I think she was sad, she said, underneath the mad voice. I think she was sad. David considered this. His 6-year-old daughter had seen something in Catherine Vaughn that he had almost missed, a layer beneath the armor that he had been too focused on the confrontation to notice. You might be right, he said. They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence. When they reached the car, David buckled Elle into her seat, tucked Pebbles into the crook of her arm, and got behind the wheel. Before he started the engine, he looked in the rearview mirror. Elle's eyes were already closed, her breathing slow and even, one hand resting on the small penguin. He sat there for a moment, watching her, and felt something settle in his chest. The call the next morning came at 9:17. Harold had reviewed the shift logs, cross-referenced them with membership records, and found a pattern that stretched back nearly 4 years. Catherine Vaughn had denied entry to 17 individuals over that period. Not one of them had been documented in any official capacity. Not one of them had received a written explanation. David listened to Harold's summary without interrupting. When Harold finished, there was a long pause. "What do you want to do?" Harold asked. David looked out the window of his apartment. Elle was at the kitchen table, drawing a picture of Pebbles with a crown on his head. "Terminate her employment," David said. "Effective immediately. Full severance, no public statement, no legal action. But she doesn't work in this industry again, not in any property I own or partner with." Harold was quiet for a moment. "That's fair," he said. "More than fair. And promote Adrian," David said. "Give him a real title and real authority. I want him in a position where he can act on what he knows is right." "Done." David ended the call and walked to the kitchen. Elle looked up from her drawing, holding it out for his inspection. Pebbles the penguin, rendered in crayon, wearing a golden crown and standing on a hill. "It's Pebbles as a king," she said, "because he's brave." David took the drawing and looked at it for a long time. "Yeah," he said, "he is. Because in the end, that was the only standard that mattered. Not what you wore, or where you came from, or whether you looked like you belonged. But whether you had the courage to stand your ground when someone tried to tell you that you didn't. Every person deserves to be treated with dignity before they prove anything, before they show you what they have, before you decide whether they belong. That's not just good business. That's just what's right." If this story stayed with you, subscribe and stick around.